Penguin Random House Audio presents Revenge of the Kremlin, a Malko Linge novel by Gérard De Villiers, translated from the French by William Rodemore, read for you by Nicholas Guy Smith. Prologue. Moscow, Spring 2013. Rem Tolkachev was so moved, his eyes were moist with tears. He reread Vladimir Putin's decree, which an orderly had hand-delivered to his little Corpus No. 14 office in the south wing of the Kremlin for the third time. The president's order created a special unit within the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service, charged with resolving sensitive situations. Its members were authorized to travel to any country in the world to secretly kill anyone the Kremlin saw as a political or economic adversary, even if they weren't under official sanction from the Russian government. It was the return of Smersh, the organization that assassinated regime opponents in the days of the Soviet Union. This was a task to which Tolkachev had devoted years of effort, drawing on unlimited resources and the support of Russia's various security agencies. President Putin was now giving official status to his unseen but invaluable role. The old spy master took no personal pride in this, and he would continue to operate in the shadows, but now he felt imbued with a nearly divine sense of mission. He mentally blessed Vladimir Vladimirovich and promised to go to the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour to pray for him. This decree was the final nail in the coffin of the despised Boris Yeltsin, who dismantled whole swaths of the Soviet Union. Life would now go back to the way it was, thought Tolkachev, with vertical power again ruling the country. It would be the USSR without communism, for which no one had any more use. Power would be wielded with an iron fist, and any remaining opponents would soon be brought to heel. For a few moments, Tolkachev almost felt that his little office shared the same solemn mood of the Kremlin's National Security Council hall, with its walls hung with Gobelin's tapestries exalting patriotic themes. Though Tolkachev was one of the most important cogs in the presidential machinery, his office door bore no name. Only its thickness and the sophistication of its digital access lock hinted at its strategic importance. The few people who knew it existed called it Osobie Sviasi, the Office of Special Affairs. No one could quite say how long Tolkachev had been working there. It was as if he'd been in that wing of the Kremlin forever, and it was almost true. For more than 20 years, the spy master had obediently followed the orders of all the nation's modern-day czars, from Mikhail Gorbachev to Vladimir Putin. Born to an NKVD general in Sverdlovsk in 1934, Tolkachev was a classic Silovik, a person who spent his entire career in the country's intelligence agencies. Gorbachev had brought him into the Kremlin during the reorganization of the Second Directorate of the old KGB, now the FSB, the Federal Security Service. Tolkachev's exemplary personnel file held not the slightest hint of corruption, and he'd shunned the machinations of KGB chief Vladimir Kryuchkov, who was arrested for plotting against Gorbachev. Not that this meant that Tolkachev approved of Gorbachev's destroying the Soviet Union. In fact, he hated the man. But Tolkachev was too much of a legalist to oppose the country's duly constituted authorities. His mission in the Kremlin was simple: to resolve thorny problems clandestinely and illegally with the president's support. The head of state need only mention a problem without suggesting any particular solution, and Tolkachev would immediately get to work on it. His heavy, steel-clad file cabinet held the most explosive secrets of two critical periods: the time immediately after communism faded and before the USSR's collapse, and the post-Soviet period a time of upheaval that saw the collapse of many values established over the previous 75 years. In fact, the cabinet held only a tiny part of the secret operations that Tolkachev had carried out, because most of the instructions he gave were oral. When a written order was required, he hand-typed a single copy on an old Remington manual. He distrusted electronic systems, which he considered too easily penetrated. Though a man of incredible power, Tolkachev didn't even have a personal secretary. But the head of every civilian and military security service knew they were to obey his orders without question. His name was one of the first ones they were given when they assumed their positions. His was the voice of the Tsar. Tolkachev would be 80 years old soon, but retirement was an alien concept to him, and no one mentioned it. He was practically part of the Kremlin furniture. Besides, who would replace him? That morning, he had driven his immaculately polished Lada from his Kastanevskaya Street apartment in western Moscow into the Kremlin through the Borovitsky Gate. People who passed him in the hallways had no idea how much power was exercised by the little old gentleman with the white hair and unremarkable face. A widower for the last 13 years, Tolkachev hardly had any social life. He usually lunched at the Kremlin's buffet number 1, where you could get a meal for less than 120 rubles. People familiar with his office saw further evidence of modesty there. The walls were bare, except for a calendar, a photo of Vladimir Putin, and an old poster of Felix Dzerzhinsky, published on his death in 1926. Dzerzhinsky, who created the Cheka, the forerunner of the KGB, was the man Tolkachev most admired in the world. In fact, his few daytime outings were always to the KGB museum on Bolshaya Lubyanka Street, to gaze at his idol's death mask. Tolkachev's desk was as Spartan as his office walls. It had only 2 telephones and a locked black address book that held the numbers he might need. One of the phones was connected to the Kremlin's inside system, but Tolkachev's number wasn't listed, and only a handful of people had it. These were usually very high-ranking officials who were told about Tolkachev when they took their jobs. Most had no idea what he looked like. All they knew of him was his somewhat high-pitched voice with an accent from Central Russia. The armored grey cabinet behind Tolkachev's desk held the files of the people he had used during the last 20 years. They were all there. Siloviki, crooks, killers, gangsters, priests, and soldiers, even the dead. To manipulate these helpers, Tolkachev had unlimited supplies of cash. Packets of bills stood neatly stacked on a cabinet shelf. When he ran low, he wrote a request to the Kremlin administrator. No justification was required, and the money would be delivered the same day. Tolkachev was scrupulously, almost pathologically honest. He would never take so much as a kopeck of the sums at his disposal, and kept a meticulous account of the amounts he spent. No one ever asked to see it. The old spy master's only pleasure was to serve the Rodina, the nation, and its incarnation, the president. A special joy these days, because the current leader symbolized the renewal of the system Tolkachev had dreamed about for years. Since becoming a widower, he rarely went out, except for a monthly evening at the Bolshoi Theatre, where he paid for his own ticket, he loved the opera, and perhaps dinner in an Italian restaurant on Red Square. When he was under pressure, he chain-smoked slim, pastel-coloured Sobrani cocktail cigarettes, taking eager little puffs as he thought. Tolkachev's reach was immense. Beneath the shell of a legalist state swarmed parallel services and obscure offices prepared to do anything to help the Kremlin solve its problems, not to mention all those members of the legal apparatus who were bound to obey the president's representative. Tolkachev glanced at Putin's order again, this time with a twinge of envy. Russia's master had just made his clandestine role official. But who would be running this new smirch? Would he be shunted aside in favor of some GRU general? It occurred to Tolkachev that his age might be the reason for such a change. Was he
Sample complete. Ready to continue?